Welcome to the first session of the fourth and last module, which takes a look at the steps and processes needed to reach market requirements. We will explore the different trade procedures that need to be met to be compliant with the requirements for customs and technical standards, as well as the rules of origin. Thank you for listening.
For the cooperatives in the role of aspirational exporters, it is important to understand the different steps involved in an export procedure, as well as the documentation requirements for the process of devising their export strategy. This session will provide an introduction to these exporting procedures and the different requirements in the export process. To benefit from exporting, cooperatives must follow both domestic laws and regulations that govern the export process in Vietnam and laws and regulations that govern imports at the target market. Many of these requirements are provided in the free trade agreement signed between Vietnam and the target exporting markets, including the import tariff and the of origin. On the other hand, sanitary and phytosanitary and technical barriers to trade requirements, which are mandatory, must follow the regulations in the target markets. Furthermore, certifications related to voluntary sustainability standards are not required by laws but can be required by the buyers. As shown in the diagram, a single cross-border trade transaction involves various stakeholders, requiring an abundance of information and document flows between parties to complete a door-to-door export transaction. The United Nations Center for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business by Ship Pay reference models provide a helpful model to visualize the different steps and processes involved in an export transaction. The color code indicates which key actors are in charge of which steps, while other actors play the collaborative or supporting roles. All documents accompanying the export shipment, such as Certificate of Origin, Export Permit, and SPS or TBT certification, should be obtained at the preparation step, while tariffs must be paid at the respective customs office, that is, export tariff paid to export customs and import tariffs paid to import customs. Cooperatives wishing to enter the export market should make sure that they understand terms of delivery for export. These terms are known as Incoterms and are issued by the International Chamber of Commerce. Incoterms are a set of 11 terms which define the obligations, costs, and risks involved in the delivery of goods in international transactions. They are typically updated every 10 years, and the most recent version is Incoterms 2020. Let us now look at the three most commonly used Incoterms. Ex works refers to when the exporter makes the goods available at their premises, and the importer is responsible for all transportation costs, risks, and any other charges from that point. Free on board is the term used when the exporter is responsible for the costs and risks associated with delivering the goods to the named port of shipment. In a free on board agreement, the exporter is responsible for the cost of loading the goods onto the vessel and the cost of transporting the goods at the port of shipment. This includes loading charges, excludes charges such as insurance, freight, and unloading charges once the goods are on board. The exporter is also responsible for the goods until the moment they pass the ship's rail at the named port of shipment. Cost, insurance, and freight refers to when the exporter is responsible for delivering the goods to the named port of shipment and is responsible for the goods being shipped, the insurance covering the goods from the exporter's location to the destination port, and freight or transportation of goods to the agreed-upon destination port. The exporter is also responsible for the goods up until they pass the ship's rail at the port of shipment. The different terms of delivery each have their advantages and disadvantages. Take a moment to look at the chart on the slide, which shows the cost and risk of each side of the international transaction for the different Incoterms. It is also key for exporters to understand the different payment terms that can be used in international trade transactions. Payments always have inherent risks for either or both sides of the transactions, depending on the payment terms agreed by the parties. We will now look closely at the different terms of payment for export. The first is cash advance, whereby an exporter can receive the payment before the ownership of the goods is transferred. These are the most favorable terms for the exporter, but the least attractive option for the buyer, as the goods may not be sent if payment is made in advance. With the advancement of the internet, escrow services are becoming another cash in advance option for small export transactions. The second payment term we will look is the letter of credit, which is a commitment by a bank on behalf of the buyer that payment will be made to the exporter, provided that the terms and conditions stated in the letter of credit have been met, as verified through the presentation of all required documents. A letter of credit is useful when reliable credit information about a foreign buyer is difficult to obtain, but the exporter is satisfied with the creditworthiness of the buyer's foreign bank. A letter of credit also protects the buyer since no payment obligation arises until the goods have been shipped as promised. Third, documentary collections is a transaction whereby the exporter entrusts the collection of the payment for a sale to its bank and the documents that its buyer needs to the importer's bank, with instructions to release the documents to the buyer for payment. Funds are received from the importer and remitted to the exporter through the banks involved in the collection in exchange for those documents. Documentary collections involve using a draft that requires the importer to pay the face amount either at sight, that is document against payment, or on a specified date, that is document against acceptance. The collection letter gives instructions that specify the documents required for the transfer of title to the goods. It should be noted that although banks do act as facilitators for their clients, documentary collections offer no verification process and limited recourse in the event of payment. Documentary collections are generally less expensive than letters of credit. Next, let us look at open account transactions. An open account transaction is a sale where the goods are shipped and delivered before payment is due, which in international sales is typically in 30, 60, or 90 days. This is one of the advantageous options to the importer but one of the highest risk options for an exporter. Exporters can offer competitive open account terms while substantially mitigating the risk of non-payment by using the appropriate trade finance instruments provided by their banks, such as export working capital financing, export credit insurance, export factor, and standby letters of credit. The final term of payment that we will explore is consignment. This is a variation of an open account in which payment is sent to the exporter only after the goods have been sold by the foreign distributor to the end customer. An international consignment transaction is based on a contractual arrangement in which the foreign distributor receives and sells the goods for the exporter, who retains title to the goods until they are sold. This is the riskiest payment term for the exporter and should be used with only reputable and trustworthy foreign distributors or third-party logistics providers with appropriate insurance to mitigate the risk of non-payment. We will now look at the steps to preparing for the export process. These steps include understanding the applicable tariffs, rules of origin, as well as the technical requirements such as SPS, TBT, and sustainable standards. We will also discuss the documentation and record-keeping requirements for exporters. To benefit from exporting, the cooperatives must follow both domestic laws and regulations that govern the export process in Vietnam and laws and regulations that govern imports at the target market. It is important for exporters to consult the requirements under these laws and regulations before embarking in the export process. The export requirements can be found in various sources. First, general rules are provided in free trade agreements signed between Vietnam and the target exporting markets. These general rules include import tariffs and rules of origin, which are also enacted through domestic regulations. SPS and TBT requirements, which are must follow the domestic regulations by importing countries. It is also important to find out if buyers require voluntary sustainability standards to be followed even if these are not required by law. Let us now look at each of these requirements in detail. First, we will look at tariffs. By definition, a tariff, or customs duty, is a financial charge in the form of a tax imposed on imported or exported products. Market access is conditional upon the payment of the customs duty. Tariffs raise revenue for the government, but they result in higher prices of products. Most goods and services exported from Vietnam are exempt from value-added tax. Export duties, ranging from 0 to 45% of the free on-board price, are only charged on a few items, mainly natural resources, such as minerals, forest products, and scrap metal. While exporters do not have to pay the import, higher import tariffs in the target market mean their products are relatively more expensive than the target market's locally produced goods or goods subject to lower tariffs. This lowers the price competitiveness of the exporter. It is therefore important for cooperatives to examine the applicable tariffs and to find out whether preferential tariffs are available in order to the price competitiveness of their exports. So, where can you find this information? The Vietnam National Trade Repository and the ITC Market Access Map provide useful tools for identifying customs tariffs and tariff rate quotas under different preferential regimes applicable to the cooperative's products. The links to these tools are provided in the slide. Let us now move on to rules of origin. As a reminder, rules of origin refer to the criteria used to determine a product's country of origin. Only originating goods from member parties of an FTA can benefit from preferential tariffs under that FTA. Vietnam currently has 16 FTAs, which provides Vietnam preferential market access to 57 countries, covering a total market size of 3.2 billion people and a total GDP of $62 trillion. In order to export to these markets with preferential tariffs, Vietnamese cooperatives must ensure that their products meet the origin requirements, and they can obtain proof of origin exporting. Such proof of origin can be in the form of a certificate of origin issued by a public authority or a declaration of origin issued by an exporter, producer, or importer if this is allowed under the trade agreement. To find information on rules of origin, you can use the Vietnam National Trade Repository portal. The ITCWTO Rules of Origin Facilitator is another useful tool for identifying rules of origin under different FTAs applicable to your products. Let us now look at technical requirements which exporters may have to fulfill. Technical requirements are a subset of non-tariff measures and are policy measures other than tariffs that can potentially impact imports and exports. Technical requirements mainly cover SPS and TBT measures. It should be noted that one measure can be PS or TBT measure, depending on its type and purpose. The type of measure, that is whether it is technical regulations, voluntary standards, or conformity assessment procedures, determines whether it is TBT, while the purpose of the measure, that is whether it aims to protect human, animal or plant life from contaminants, toxins, or diseases, is relevant in determining whether it is subject to the SPS agreement. SPS refers to measures applied by governments to protect human, animal or plant life or health from risks arising from the introduction, establishment and spread of pests and diseases and from risks arising from additives, toxins and contaminants in food and feed. These measures apply to domestically produced food or local animal and plant diseases, as well as to products coming from other countries. Examples of SPS measures include quarantine treatments, requirements on residue levels of pesticides, veterinary drugs, or other additives in food and feed, labeling, marking, and packaging requirements related to sanitary and phytosanitary conditions of food and feeds among others. Let us now look at TBT measures. TBT refers to measures that countries use to regulate markets, protect human, animal or plant life or health, and protect the environment. TBT includes mandatory product regulation, voluntary product standards, and conformity assessment procedures. Examples of TBT measures include labeling requirements, product quality, safety, or performance requirements, product registration requirements, inspection requirements, and traceability requirements among others. In order to access foreign markets, the cooperatives must meet the technical requirements of those markets. Therefore, the cooperatives should take technical requirements into account in their export strategy. Cooperatives should first consider whether their products currently meet the technical requirements of the target markets and, if not, what modifications are needed. When their product the technical requirements, cooperatives should also make sure that they can obtain the necessary certificates for exporting the products. So, where can you find information on technical requirements? The Vietnam National Trade Repository and the ITC Market Access Map provide useful tools for identifying technical requirements of different markets. It should be noted that the Vietnam National Trade Repository provides information on the technical requirements issued and enforced by the Vietnamese government for both domestic and imported products. On the other hand, the ITC Market Map can provide information on the technical measures required by the target market of Vietnam's export. We will now look at sustainable standards. There are two types of such standards: voluntary sustainable standards and regulatory sustainable requirements. Voluntary sustainable standards are private standards that require products to meet specific economic, social, and environmental sustainability metrics. The requirements refer to product quality or attributes, as well as production, processing, and transportation methods. Voluntary sustainable standards are mostly designed and promoted by non-governmental organizations or private firms and are adopted by value chain actors, from farmers to retailers. Certifications and labels are used in the successful implementation of voluntary sustainable standards. Although voluntary sustainable standards are voluntary, their increased uptake and consumer demand for sustainable products suggest that they are becoming increasingly important. To meet consumer demand, cooperatives should not only follow the mandatory technical regulations but also the voluntary standards requested by the buyers and consumers in the target markets. Some popular voluntary standards that you may already be familiar with are the Global Good Agricultural Practice known as Global GAP, Fair Trade, and USDA Organic. The second type of sustainable standards refers to several new regulatory initiatives have been enacted by countries of the world, imposing due diligence requirements on firms. Example includes the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the EU Deforestation Regulation, and Canada's Fighting Against Forced Labour and Child Labour in Supply Chains Act. While currently, Vietnamese cooperatives might not be directly subject to regulatory requirements on due diligence in the target markets, they might be impacted as the cooperatives increasingly export and participate in the global value chains. The ITC Standards Map is a useful tool to identify voluntary sustainable standards applicable to specific products. The link to this tool is provided in the slide. Customs requires several documents to be submitted for exported goods. These include the Customs Declaration, list of products for exported raw wood, the export license from the competent authority, SPS or TBT certificates, documents proving that organizations are eligible to export goods, entrustment contract for export, certificate of origin if claiming preferential treatment, bill of lading, packing list and commercial contract. Note that requirements can change over time, so you should always check for the latest requirements. Record keeping is an important activity of export to ensure compliance with government authorities' requirements for verification or audits. Vietnamese customs law requires exporters to retain customs records and related accounting documents for cleared goods for a period of 5 years from the date of registration of the customs declaration. Furthermore, the exporters are also required to provide relevant information and documents when requested by the customs authority requests for inspection and auditing purposes. You should note that the time period required for record keeping can vary for different documents used in the export procedures under specialized regulations or under the FTAs that Vietnam is currently a member of. For example, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership requires that exporters, producers, and importers maintain all records necessary to demonstrate that a good for which the exporter or producer provided a certification of origin is originating. For producers and exporters, these records have to be maintained for a period of no less than 5 years from the date the certification of origin was issued. For importers, the timeline is 5 years from the date of importation of the goods. It is key for cooperatives to ensure that there is personnel assigned to take care of export documentation, other than the accounting department, which is in charge of accounting documents. Such personnel would ensure a filing and record-keeping system for export-related documents and would also be responsible for ensuring that the export-related documents are retained during the required period. Thank you for listening to this module, and we look forward to welcoming you in the next sessions.